Okay, welcome back. We are absolutely delighted to have Professor Eve Darian Smith deliver the final TLI Distinguished Lecture for the Summer Institute titled Law and Interdisciplinarity, Law and Society and the Future of Law and Context. Most of us know Eve very well because she's been with us from the start of the Summer Institute. Thank you. But we have a whole new cohort of TLSI faculty who have just joined us, so I will introduce Eve yet again to all of you. So Eve is professor and chair of the Department of Global Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. She's trained both as a lawyer and an anthropologist, and she's interested in issues of post-colonialism, legal pluralism, and socio-legal theory. And she's written 4 books and edited 6 volumes. And her first book, Bridging Divides, The Channel Tunnel, and English Legal Identity in the New Europe, which was published in 2009, won the US Law and Society Association Herbert Jacob Book Prize. And she has numerous other books, which I think we are all familiar with, including Laws of the Post-Colonial, New Capitalist Law, Politics, and Identity Surrounding Casino Gaming on Native American Land, Religion, Race, Rights, Landmarks in the History of Modern Anglo-American Law, and most recently, the book that we're reading today, Laws and Societies in Global Contexts, Contemporary Approaches. And her forthcoming book from Cambridge is called New Indian Wars, Indigenous Sovereignty in Global Perspective. And so the plan for now is that she will speak for about half an hour to 45 minutes, and if we have the time, then she's open to questions from you all. If not, we'll have a quick coffee break before we then continue reading her book. Thanks, Eve.
So thank you, Prabha, for a lovely, lovely introduction. And I didn't have the chance to say with respect to the session we just had, but it is truly, truly an honor to have people of such intellectual weight and presence and innovation talk about my book and engage with it seriously. So truly, it is an extremely great pleasure to be here. It's a marvelous day. It's one of the most wondrous days of my academic career to have people take my work seriously. So it is really very great. I would like to thank, of course, Pierre and Prabha and Helen and all you fellows who have held together in such camaraderie and solidarity over the last week and a half. The end is in sight, but this truly has been a spectacular intellectual engagement, and we have some very interesting days ahead of us. But thank you all for being here, and of course to the faculty who have just joined us. It is really a marvelous opportunity to have your thoughts and comments be part of this extremely important gathering of the Institute. I wanted to just say a little bit about my book, because some of you may know, some of you may not know, but I specifically designed it for teaching. So to have this as a sort of large teaching engagement, a pedagogical conversation, a theoretical conversation, to have people come up and say, like Marag, I actually teach with your book, is truly, truly wonderful, because really I do think of it as a conversation, as people said this morning, an intervention, ongoing dialogue. And to that effect, I wanted to just, there's talk of possibly having a second edition, but that second edition of the book would involve more readings from Global South scholars in each of those chapters. So if you come across wonderful readings in Spanish or other languages that we could translate perhaps into English, because the whole idea is meant to be in increasing the conversation and opening it up. And so the fault, or one of the faults of my book, is that it's still very much possibly an Anglophile kind of conversation today. And so we all together, moving forward in this kind of project, collaborative project, could add further readings that others could then see as important in each of those chapter conversations. Today, my talk sort of, in a sense, repeats some of the themes of this morning, but hopefully in perhaps a slightly different way. But it certainly builds on many of the exciting conversations we've been engaged with over the past 2 weeks, and which together as a group we've been pushing in terms of trying to define, or at least think about, what we mean by transnational law. And specifically in my comments today, I'm thinking of Boa's talk at the very beginning and Upen's talk on Monday, which together encouraged us to be rebellious and push against the grain in order to focus on issues not just of law, but of course of justice. So not just of positivist law, but and getting past the instrumental practicalities of law, but to focus on what we mean by justice and the differentiation between those terms. Dubois started last week by saying we need to train competent rebels, not incompetent reformists, which I think is a wonderful quote. And UPenn declared in a wonderful call to all of us on Monday that we need epistemic insubordination, and he said a cultural revolution in law, which is also a very, very important call to all of us. So while it's more than daunting, very, very daunting to follow these great, great scholars' inspiring talks with my own, I'm very pleased to further our collective ambitions for rebellion that push against accepted ways of thinking and that promote transgression. So I want to sort of have that as an undercurrent, transgression, focusing on the trans. Specifically, I'll be talking about the need to add a global imaginary to our conversations about transnational law, which have, as I say, been extraordinarily exciting, yet still appear, in my view, to remain somewhat anchored, and this is the main point of my talk today, within a Eurocentric and modernist contextualization. So the sort of subtitle of my talk today is Overlapping and Intersecting Legal Contexts, and it builds upon the interdisciplinary work of legal geographers, legal anthropologists, global historians, and of course legal and social theorists. And it sort of urges us to think about what may be the appropriate context for social legal analysis as we head toward the middle decades of the 21st century. My argument is that in the current moment, the context of our own legal imagination is curtailed, prescribed, and as a result limited. And that these limitations are significant if we truly want to embrace the call for emancipatory action that Dubois urged us to do, and which others on this morning's panel also called for us to do, to be radicals, and to be resist, and to take action. Just as a sort of side note here, a lot of these conversations, and some of you may know the work of W.B. Du Bois, who really was one of the most incredibly important racial and social theorists of the 20th century in the United States, and he's known for terms like the color line. But he actually was what one would call now a global historian. And I very much take to heart his kinds of resistances and moves to try and reframe the context of the racial conversations in the post-colonial moment. But what I really got from his work, and I have actually published a little bit about this, is that he initially thought of, he was very much part of Pan-African social movements, and was of course the founder of the NAACP in the United States, but he initially began thinking about colonialism and oppression as very much a European phenomena, and that subjugated peoples in the Third World, or the so-called Global South. And it was only in the context of the Second World War and the Holocaust that he actually had to reframe his understanding of racial oppression in the world. Because he argued, and it's a very significant contribution of his work, that the logics that actually underscored colonialism had turned around and actually come to bear and were part of the understanding of the Nazi regime and the Holocaust oppressions of German peoples. And so he actually turned around a global perspective. He had a very much prior to that, a core periphery understanding of the world, Europe as the core, and the global South as the periphery. But it was with the Second World War that he actually reframed his understanding of the logics of violence and oppression and the legal framings of that to actually say the logics have a global interconnectedness. And I just wanted to mention that because I think it actually is important in thinking about the contemporary moment. Okay, so what do I mean by saying that the context of our own legal imagination is currently limited? In my view, one of the most pressing challenges for us all is to adequately take into account the globalized dimensions of legal practices in which everyday social relations are nestled, nurtured, negotiated, negated, silenced. Remember we talked about silence in the first week here, and at the same time are being renewed and emerging in different configurations. In a world in which law increasingly serves a market-driven logic that threatens to hollow out our notions of democracy, we need to think seriously about the limits of our legal categories and concepts. As critical transnational legal scholars, I think it's important to note the contextual limitations of mainstream legal analysis and the need to rethink concepts such as sovereignty, justice, property, citizenship, rights, and so on, in light of global inequalities and new forms of colonial violence. We need to decolonize the law schools, which Boa mentioned in his talk, and others have noted about decolonizing legal knowledge. And we need to think in terms of law in a global paradigm, which underscores our complex, interrelated worlds. In this effort, I call upon us to embrace a global imaginary and a global consciousness. This means that we need to liberate ourselves and our political and ideological beliefs from the constraints of the modernist nation-state, which continue to dominate our world perspective, and in particular, our Western legal modes of thinking. With respect to today's talk, I first want to reflect a little bit about how we've been using the concept and the term transnational law, and how this may differ from a global socio-legal perspective. I then want to talk a little bit about a watershed, what I think is a watershed moment in shaping a global legal imaginary that emerged in the second half of the 20th century. And finally, I want to turn to some of the two recent writings by Saskia Sassen and Wendy Brown to engage with the current dominance of neoliberalism, which was part of our panel this morning, and its economic logics. Drawing on their theoretical contributions, I talk about new legal spaces and what these spaces suggest with respect to expanding a more globally inclusive socio-legal perspective. Okay, so I now want to talk about transnational law. And I'm not saying that this is the only things that we talked about, but when I went on Google, I just put in transnational law. This is one of the typical kind of definitions that come up. And I think I'm talking about this because while we as a group think of transnational law, I think in much more sophisticated and nuanced ways, as reflected in all the conversations to date, when we leave here, we are going to be asked, what did you do? I went to a transnational law institute. What's transnational law? So I think it is important that we, in a sense, get our definitional, or at least what we think it could incorporate, a little bit clearer before we leave. And I'm asking us, or urging us, to think that we have to layer on this global consciousness, global imaginary. But this is a very typical definition, and as you can see, it's rather anchored, or at least it is primarily anchored, still in the concept of the nation-state, okay? And I'm not going to read that, but you can see what it is. So what struck me in our conversations to date, or at least primarily in our conversations to date, the nation-state is still taken as very much a given, analytically a given. We've been discussing new combinations of national, international law, new legal relations beyond and below the nation-state, and certainly our conversations have touched upon some of the disruptions to the conventional divides between public and private law, and how these may inform new linkages between laws and societies. But nonetheless, our discussions so far have been primarily, as I say, anchored in state institutions, state actors, state forms of legitimacy, and projections of state institutions beyond the state. Okay, so that's how we've been talking typically about transnational law. It's stuff as the poster, beyond the domestic, it's beyond the nation state. But by actually even formulating in that way, we actually have to hold on to a concept as a given, the nation state. So what I have found interesting amongst many of our conversations is that they tend, I imagine inadvertently, to echo the core periphery models of development that Dubois, as I mentioned, managed to overcome, or they tend to echo early explanations of legal pluralism under colonial conditions. And by that I mean it's where the states are at the center, at the core, and non-state actors chip away and dislodge and blur the boundaries around what is presumed to be the central core. So that, to me, is a way of thinking about colonial legal pluralism that's very much part of a colonial context. I think we need to shift our legal pluralism in a slightly different way, because this is a very modernist understanding both of legal pluralism and our debates, as I say, or our conversations tend to have that core periphery implicit structure to them. So unfortunately, I think it appears that we are ultimately still bound to a modernist paradigm. And so while we're talking about post-Westphalian moments and recognizing the destabilization of the nation-state and the emergence of a range of new possible transnational processes, we're still anchored to a national imaginary and its intellectual histories and legal legacies. So why is this important? Why is this grounding still in a nationalist imaginary something that I think we need to at least reflect upon? And I would argue it's important because by anchoring ourselves to outmoded ways of legal thinking, we fail to see pervasive and growing global challenges to concepts such as democracy, equality, and freedom. Moreover, and I think that this is a very important point, we also fail to recognize emerging counter-hegemonic impulses and alternative legal and social ways of being that may offer us insights on how best to deal with these global challenges. Okay, so by blinkering our conceptual, contextual frames of thinking, we both don't recognize some of the enormous challenges that are insidiously coming to get us, as it were, but we also don't necessarily recognize some of the new kinds of alternative ways of thinking. So, of course, I don't want to suggest that national contexts don't matter. And of course they matter, and they matter in extremely important ways, as was touched upon this morning. National contexts that frame legal philosophy, jurisprudential thinking, and of course practical understandings and meanings of legal concepts for the last 200, 300, 400 years. But as I stressed in my book, these nationalist framings and their embedded temporal and spatial orderings of social life are no longer adequate or appropriate in our current era. So it's not to say that nation states are now obsolete, as the rise of right-wing xenophobic politics, both in Europe and around the world, attests. It is precisely in the context of new global forces that states are in fact escalating border controls and claims of territorial sovereignty. But what I am suggesting is that the limits of our nationalist-based imaginary needs to be recognized and seen as an obstacle to more inclusive and progressive political activism. And congruent to this recognition is a need to think about a more complex and pluralist understanding of what we mean by law. And as been discussed this morning, I call this a global sociolegal perspective, and this involves, as I hope to explain a little bit more in this talk, adopting a global imaginary in our teaching and research that prompts us to constantly question our taken for granted assumptions surrounding the production of legal knowledge and how we think we know and claim to understand law. Okay, so what do I mean by a global imaginary? So this is a very, very basic sort of conceptual map. But the first thing I want to note is that a global imaginary, however, and there's many, many ways that we could talk about what that is, but however we actually define it, is something different from an international and transnational imaginary. The international speaks to the interactions between nation states. Of course, think of the United Nations as a sort of example of that, while the transnational speaks to the interactions beyond the nation state, beyond the jurisdictional boundaries of the state. While still using the national, be it international or transnational, the national is still used as an anchor of the imaginative reach of the international and the transnational. In contrast, a global imaginary includes nation states, but it doesn't necessarily privilege them. It includes, of course, a huge array of non-state actors, organizations, collectivities, processes, relations, ways of knowing, modes of interaction across, between, and within national and transnational contexts. And in this way, I think a global imaginary should be thought of as conceptually and epistemologically more encompassing than the transnational and the international, which, as I say, are anchored primarily still to the idea, the concept of the nation state. So hence, I would suggest a global imaginary exists in an easy tension with the national imaginary, and in fact intrinsically challenge its presumptive authority and centrality. A global imaginary may provide alternative ways of thinking about social relations and behaviors that are not limited by state systems and not limited by concepts of state sovereignty, territoriality, citizenship, and nationalism. And of course, this can include a whole range of non-Western worldviews, cosmologies, aesthetics, values, and even alternative understandings of what it means to be human. So this is my very, very sort of basic attempt to try and give you some sort of mapping of the national, transnational, and international as sort of nested conceptually around the nation state, and that the global is a bigger arena in which processes and actions can be imagined to be occurring. So the second point I want to make is that we need to complicate how a global imaginary is typically talked about in mainstream society and media. Most people think of the global in geopolitical terms and correlate it to processes and concepts that transcend the borders of the state. And that's typically how we have been talking about it. The global is often talked about as involving a global, as in a worldwide spatial reach, and today has become synonymous with processes of globalization and economic transnational activities. But in contrast to this overarching geographical conceptualization of the global, I want to suggest it's not a matter of the spatial scale or the geopolitical reach that makes any law or legal process global. Global doesn't just mean something big, in other words. The local and the global are mutually constitutive, creating and recreating each other across conceptual fields in a constant dynamic. And this means that the global is not only found in large macro processes, but also can be found in cosmopolitan cities and multinational corporations, but also in villages and neighborhoods and workplaces and family homes. And actually, many of the conversations that we had, Prabha and I had in our ethnography working group, people really are engaging with this. So for some of you, this is part of your actual research agenda, and I'm thinking of Emma and Matt Canfield and Giulia Fabini in their work, very, very much thinking about how the global manifests in people, in legal subjectivities. So to reiterate, my argument is that the global is present where global scale processes become manifest in real world contexts in the lives of ordinary people. Putting it another way, what makes a law or legal process global are the questions one asks that reveal its global dimensions, even if at first glance it appears a very small scale, very localized, very intimate, very personal. And this is what I'm trying to underscore when I talk about a global socio-legal perspective. It is something much more than a nesting of geopolitical scales and jurisdictional levels, and involves a new conceptualization of legal practice within a global imaginary. So while, of course, this is how we've often been talking about it, what's below the state, what's above the state, and how they interact, what I'm suggesting is that this is okay, but it's actually not sophisticated enough. It's a rather simplistic framing or mapping of what we're talking about when we talk about transnational law that privileges the state. And in contrast, very much leaning on the works of Saskia Sassen and others, I like to think of this as overlapping assemblages of power. And here I try to show that the local, in fact, can be privileged and given an authority and a weight that we typically denigrate to not having as much impact. And by thinking about the overlapping legal processes here, what I think is important is that it sort of disrupts our taken for granted understandings of cause and effect, taken for granted assumptions that the bigger the legal power, the more important it is, because in fact the local, the less powerful in terms of political power, could in fact have significant legal implications for the way we think about the future of social relations. So it's just trying to shake up the sort of taken for granted nesting arrangements based on geopolitical space and give us a more nuanced global imaginary framework. Okay, so in thinking about a global socio-legal imaginary, I want to briefly turn to what I think is a watershed moment in terms of opening up people's capacities to imagine a new global perspective, and specifically people's capacities to think in terms of global democracy and freedom. And this watershed moment, which is also an excuse for me to show you some nice slides, is wonderfully represented in New York's World Fair in 1964. So this was a very important World Fair. 51 million people apparently visited it. And it hailed itself as universal and international, reflecting the sentiment of New York's United Nations, which had just been established and triumphed over the horrors of Nazi Germany, And it played an important role, of course, in connecting millions of displaced people after the war. So this fair is really sort of a triumphalist moment of the United Nations, Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, and of course the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This World Fair also reflected the optimistic momentum of decolonization that escalated the 1960s and liberated millions of people, of course, in former colonial places around the world. The fair represented as well the promise of technology and advanced communications to link people around the world in new ways. Interestingly, 1964, Walt Disney had his It's a Small World ride established, and here he is, and the little dolls around the world. So it really was this, watershed moment in terms of many things that we now associate with American culture, but it was meant to be an embracing of other places and other cultures and other contexts. I couldn't help but put this picture in because the Carousel of Progress, just the very thought of a carousel, a ride, it really to me is just a wonderful illustration of the optimism and the very modernist understanding of the world that's presented in this fair. But it was really also extremely amazing in terms of the technologies and the new buildings. So it really was a reflection of people's imaginations of another world entirely, okay? A space, outer space kind of world. Here's a picture at night where it truly looks very, very magical and unreal, as it were. So that's just some of the buildings that gives you a sense. And this is the period of, I don't know if anyone saw that telly show as a kid, Lost in Space. This is the period, all right, where we're dating myself there. But this is the period of the 60s and the optimism of actually thinking about a different kind of interconnected world. With all these wondrous events going on at the World Fair, the biggest attraction, of course, was what's called the Unisphere. And this was a huge, huge, enormous stainless steel structure, 12 stories high, and it was designed as a symbol celebrating man's achievements on a shrinking globe in an expanding universe. In a sort of similar way that echoed 80 years earlier, it was considered to be a sort of monument to the symbol of freedom and the promise of global democracy. So 80 years earlier, of course, you have the bringing over from Paris of the Statue of Liberty, and here is the 1964 World Fair in a similar mode of enormous American liberation of global democracy. Interestingly, the Unisphere also reflected, of course, the new space age, which I mentioned with the Lost in Space show, and of course Apollo 8, which a couple of years later gave humankind its first glimpse of what the Earth looked like from outer space. So this photo really is often talked about as providing a new perspective on the Earth, for many of us, that this is a new understanding of how we're actually a little tiny, what often was referred to as a blue marble in an enormous constellation of outer space. So this is when 3 astronauts saw the dark side of the moon, and this is called Earthrise. And of course, in 1969, 1 year after this photo was taken, you have the first man walking on the moon. So together, the United Nations, the World's Fair, and the excess of Apollo 8 and Apollo 11 with men walking on the moon was a remarkable, very, very intense period of a few years in which a new global imaginary of mankind's interconnectedness emerged and took on weighty significance. This was further demonstrated 1 year later, 1970, by the mass demonstrations celebrating the first Earth Day, in which it was estimated that 20 million Americans took to the streets in a mass demonstration. There were demonstrations all around the world, and helped launch Green Party politics in Australia, and then Switzerland, Britain, and Germany. So this really, I think, was a watershed moment in which people actually appreciated that they had to live together in some sort of format, that they actually couldn't be constantly at war, and we have the emergence of the European economic community at this time, and a realization that the horrors of what we can do to each other is not just occurring on the peripheries, in the colonial peripheries, but actually that logic of extreme violence and horror can come back and haunt us all in our own countries and in our own homes. Today, a global imaginary in which people all around the world are supposedly united in common purpose and common mind has become ubiquitous. Well, that's the headlines for Earth Day, which really was a very interesting beginning of the environmental movement. So, today, these pictures are ubiquitous, as we all know it. Images of global connections have become pervasive in mass marketing and permeate the neoliberal narratives that have flourished for the past 40 years. Everyone supposedly lives in a deterritorialized virtual harmony within what the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan famously termed in 1962 the global village. However, against the upbeat rhetoric of global inclusion that flourished in the later half of the 20th century, we can no longer pretend to ignore the dark side, the oppressive historical realities that sustain the global imaginary. The jubilant Unisphere imagery of the World Fair in 1964, of course, was very much a veil to the Cold War realities of the 60s, the building of the Berlin Wall, fears of nuclear warfare, and extreme violence accompanying liberation movements throughout Africa and Latin America. In a similar way, the happy global village imaginary of neoliberalism has today exploded with the realization that economic globalization and the market logics that it proposes have reigned since the 1980s, have ushered in a new age of extraordinary inequality, poverty, terror, insecurity, religious violence, and mass dispossession and displacement. And that's just to give you, as you all know only too well, of the horrors of global inequality, which have reached an all-time peak in our understanding of inequalities and inequities around the world. So Saskia Sassen has just written a new book that came out last year, in fact, called Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy. And in that she writes that we have entered a new era of capitalism in the 21st century. She writes that in the post-Second World era, the era of the World Fair, the market was driven by a logic, or the world, at least the American, European world, was driven by a logic of inclusion, by concerted efforts to bring the poor and the marginalized into the political and economic mainstream. Okay, so that's very much what we think of the liberal welfare state. But she goes on and she writes, and this is a quote, "But the nation-based assumptions underlying this project of building the just society began to crumble toward the century's end." End of quote. Today, she goes on, the cost for maintaining functioning societies is antithetical to the economic logics driving financial markets. And as a result, today's pervasive global system, economic system, seeks to expel ordinary people from civil and political life. And yesterday we had Raj, and hopefully he'll be talking this afternoon a little bit more about the work on his work on dispossession and displacement and the massive, massive land grabs that we're seeing all around the world. So what we're currently experiencing is the undoing of the liberal welfare state, the dismantling of the middle classes, the crushing of failed states such as Greece and others who have become victims of the IMF and the World Bank's structural adjustment schemes, the promotion of unending civil and regional wars and remote drone warfare, the incarceration of millions in for-profit jails, the abandonment of people in what BOA called last week liquid cemeteries, the escalation of massive permanent refugee camps around the world, and the slow, deadly violence of environmental degradation and climate change. These are all instances of people being expelled from public life. Many of these people have been abandoned by their countries, have no recourse to national, international laws, and will probably live their lives expelled from state protections and capacities to access laws of any sort. This horrific reality is driven by the new logics of finance capitalism that sees more value in land and natural resources than value in people as workers and consumers, which is really how we think of market capitalism in the later half of the 20th century, but Saskia Sassen argues that we've entered a completely different form of capitalism. So further to our conversation this morning about what is neoliberalism, which means different things to different people, and we could argue a lot about its actual mechanics. Saskia Sassen is actually saying we've entered a different kind of financial logics that actually even exceeds our conversations today about neoliberalism. As reported by the Office of the United Nations, which is only a couple of weeks ago on June 17th, there are now more people on the run from oppression and more refugees in the world than since the staggering figures post-Second World War. Nearly 14 million people were newly displaced last year alone, and this figure includes 11 million people scattered within the borders of their own countries. Okay, so again, it puts a different kind of weight on what is a refugee. We are talking about refugees within nation states. So what does all this mean in our discussion on transnational law? Saskia Sassen argues that in light of the massive expulsions of humanity from political life, our conventional way of governing through law and nation states is entirely inadequate. Wendy Brown, another very important social theorist, adds in her book, which just came out very recently this year, it's called Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism's Stealth Revolution. She argues that the all-consuming rationality of neoliberalism as it is currently configured is threatening the very nature of democracy by replacing economic concerns over political concerns. And together these two scholars paint a very, very grim picture. But importantly, because this is important, they also talk about a future that is not entirely devoid of hope. And I come away from reading their work with two main points I think are pertinent to our conversations about transnational law. So the first point, both Saskia Sassen and Wendy Brown, point to the need to reevaluate our concepts and modes of thinking, to formulate new forms of global citizenship, interconnected social relations, and ways of understanding freedom, equality, and shared systems of power. And I interpret their calls I interpret their writings as a call to widen the context of our legal imaginations, which insist on remaining loyal to a naturalized system of nation states led by supposedly accountable, if not responsible, state governments. So I take their conversations about this new form of finance logic, and I interpret it for our conversations that we really need to rethink our naturalized system of nation states that we are tending to take as a given. And our belief still, despite what we see in the newspapers, that state governments will actually be accountable in some way, even if, as I say, they're not entirely responsible, that they will be accountable, and that they will be accountable to the people. And I think both of these theorists argue that that's actually, we're past that possibility. Building on their theories, I see this as a need to move away from a modernist Western paradigm that has historically reified boundaries and binaries. And particularly I'm thinking of the binaries that we typically see, us, them, global north, global south, legal, illegal, colonizers, colonized, and core and periphery. These binaries, I suggest, no longer make sense, given that the third world now exists in the first world, and there is very, very much confusion today over who are the contemporary colonizers and colonized, because there's no doubt we're in a neo-colonial moment, but who actually is doing the colonizing and who is the victim here is raising big questions that we can no longer accept that it's just former colonial countries. This suggests that we need to decenter our analytical categories, and we need to re-embrace a global imaginary of inclusion, such as occurred in the post-Second World War era, but without naively believing in Western industrial states as the driving force and the only source of emancipation and possibility. So here I just wanted to pause because I think the conversations this morning, Patricia Chewitt's very, very important intervention about the cautionary tale of reenacting and reinscribing racial exclusions and new forms of legality, I think is very, very important. We just need to pause. Not everything that's new is great, and we have to be very sensitive to what we are inadvertently proposing here. Nonetheless, I still think we need to think in a new global imaginary with a less naive privileging of the nation-state as the liberal channel and avenue of emancipation. The second point I take away from Saskia Sassen and Wendy Brown's work sees hope in turning to the spaces of the expelled, the local, the immediate. So Saskia Sassen really says, despite all this expulsion of people from political and civic life, actually the spaces they occupy are not empty, okay? And they actually hold out a possibility to rethink from where we might move forward. And this is a quote, and I think it's an important quote. She writes, "When dynamics of expulsion proliferate, whether in the shape of the shrunken economy of Greece, the predatory elites of Angola, or the growth of the long-term unemployed or the incarcerated, the space of the expelled expands and becomes increasingly differentiated. It is not simply a dark hole. It is present and should be conceived as an informal jurisdiction. Moreover, the spaces of the expelled cry out for conceptual recognition. They are potentially the new spaces for making local economies, making new histories, and making new modes of membership," end quote. That's on page 222. So this referencing of new spaces and informal jurisdiction to me is very exciting. It reminds me of some of the very important work coming out of legal geography, and in particular, an edited volume that came out last year called The Expanding Spaces of Law. And some of you may know this work. David Delaney and Nick Blomley are the editors. Here one finds a wealth of empirical studies engaging with the concept of law, legal territory, and legal jurisdiction, not as given, taken for granted objects, but as relational constellations of power and normative interactions. With respect to my own research, exploring the spaces of the expelled speaks to my interest in Indigenous politics. Indigenous peoples, as many of you know, there are quite a number of people working on Indigenous law and politics, constitute roughly 350 million people around the world. And as the most marginalized ethnic sector in the world, they are now mobilizing in very interesting ways. They're mobilizing globally to challenge the modernist national international paradigm and promote new relational visions of being and living in the world. And this, I think, links up to the conversation yesterday, Yupen's talk, when he talked about indigenous conceptualizations of Mother Earth, of a new kind of imaginary, not for them, but for us, of thinking about how we situate ourselves within complex ecological systems. While it's important, of course, not to lump all Indigenous peoples into one monolithic category, I'm very sensitive to that, and of course I can't do it justice here, and it's also very important not to romanticize alternative perspectives on how one lives in the world. I nonetheless think that Indigenous politics do help us to recognize our conceptual limitations by promoting new understandings of law, sovereignty, self-determination, property, and so on, that do not sit easily within Western legal categories or vocabularies. And an example of this is the UN 2007 Declaration on the Rights for Indigenous Peoples that elevated Indigenous rights to an international level, but also provided the opportunity for globally mobilized and globally conscious local Indigenous communities to directly confront the limits of the UN's state-bound legal paradigm. That's what I think is very, very, very fascinating. And I love to show this image, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Did you mean it? Did you really mean it? Okay, are you really going to allow us the right to determine how we want to live in the world on our terms, not yours? Which also can mean we don't want to engage with you at all. And this is where I want to conclude my thoughts by returning to the earlier discussion about conceptual imaginaries. As transnational legal scholars, I think that we need to be flexible thinkers and challenge our taken for granted assumptions about how power works and re-examine the legal concepts that correlate to power. As transnational legal scholars, we should be careful about not reifying or unduly privileging the nation state and viewing everything as operating either above or below its framing parameters. In other words, we need to analytically decenter the nation state despite the fact that some states remain extremely powerful legal actors. And as transnational legal scholars, I want to suggest that it is entirely appropriate, if not imperative, to foreground people living within local and intimate communities, whether or not they're expelled from political life. We should be anxious to explore the global sociolegal dimensions of the local and how these may in turn be reconstituting national laws and contexts. And I know some of us have been talking along these lines, but I thought it might be helpful to put up some sort of graphic there. Blowing up the local is actually a privileged space, bigger in some sense than the nation, and how it actually can be refracted through many constellations of power and legality, and in fact impact the nation in ways that we may not even be able to understand or appreciate at this particular moment in time. So in sum, adopting a global imaginary and a global perspective means recognizing alternative non-Western epistemologies and pluralist legal systems, as the World Social Forum promotes, about thinking what would another world look like and how may it be possible. Adopting a global imaginary means appreciating that what happens in one part of the world affects and influences what is happening in other parts of the world. Hence, aspirations for global democracy necessarily involve us and them, because another person's insecurity is only a few steps removed from our own. Finally, as transnational legal scholars, adopting a global imaginary means understanding the overlapping and intersecting legal contexts in which all of our work is situated. And here, I want to leave you with what I think is a unique and a wonderfully grounded perspective from the ground, looking right up through the center of the Unisphere and encapsulating the whole relationship between groundedness and a global imaginary. So thank you.